Diversity in private equity. Let's find out what it means. Are we talking about quotas? Are we all going to go woke? Let's find out. So the topic in today's video is the question of diversity in private equity. And as we may be familiar, that's a part of ESG. It's the S in G. There's clearly been a lot of talk about environmental good practice, about governance, but what about the social, which we obviously can note that is quite culture specific. Given that diversity is quite a culture specific question, I think it's a good idea that I give you the point of view from which I'm looking at it. So if we look at the 2020 McKinsey report on private equity, on global private equity, McKinsey estimates that there's 6,700 active private equity firms, and that 250 of these account for 65% of all fundraising. If I use the figure of 1.4 trillion of dry powder, that means we've got 250 firms who manage on average 3.6 billion, and 6,450 firms who manage on average 76 million. So it's really a tale of two different realities. And from my point of view as a mid-cap GP, I'm trying to look at it from the point of view of that 6,450 mid-cap GPs, who from my personal experience tend to be quite middle of the road people, so neither extreme on the right-wing sort of nationalist side, neither extreme on the left-wing kind of political correctness side, but kind of central, a centrist view of the world. One other thing I'd like to mention before we get started is I believe in facts. So let's take the example of my mid-cap investment team. In my particular case, a majority of my investment team are women. So I'm not talking about back office staff, I'm talking about investment officers. Majority women. And of the three senior people in the firm, three most senior, 1 in 3 is a woman. So those are my kind of gender credentials. So what is the debate today? Well, the debate's about diversity, and we're going to have to look at what that means, but the obvious one we could start with is gender. And if we look at the McKinsey report of 2020, I'm just looking down at my notes from time to time, so please bear with me. McKinsey says that women account for a minority, 1 in 5 of private market employees. Most women in private equity are in back or middle office roles, and women are promoted more slowly than men. So McKinsey estimates that there is an issue with diversity from a gender point of view in private equity. Now, one of the arguments to be made is whether the greater diversity in a private equity firm will result in better outcomes or in a more successful firm, as it were. So what evidence do we have so far? Well, I think the one important thing I could quote is that we could take the example of Norway, which about 13, 14 years legally mandated that women should occupy, I think it was 40% of all board seats on public companies. So there was a mandatory quota by women, and this was proposed by an academic called Morten Huss, who was a well-known academic thinker in Norway. And 14 years on, Morten Huss reversed his position and took the view that it didn't make any difference, because all the evidence was that it did not make any difference to the company's performance whether they had a 40% quota for women or otherwise. So that's one piece of evidence, let's say, from the wider corporate world. Let's look at what we have in terms of evidence specifically from our private equity sector. So I've managed, in doing my research, I found 2 studies. One was by Gompers and Kovali, and they said that they found that VC firms, so specifically to VC, that improved their hiring rates by 10% of female partners, saw an improvement in their performance. So that's one particular study, and I think that was mostly in VC in the US. Another study I found in Europe by Oliver Gottschalk, who's a fairly well-known academic in private equity, looked at buyout firms and saw that buyout teams with at least one woman partner outperformed the all-male team. So there's some sort of evidence that a greater diversity from a gender point of view can have an effect on performance. But I I would think that there's still more work to be done. These are two kind of very early studies, but they're certainly positive and point in the correct direction. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what do we mean when we're talking about greater diversity in private equity? Are we going to be talking about diversity by gender, by ethnic background, by age, by level of education, by other criteria? Because that's something that needs to obviously be thought about. So that's one of the issues I'm going to try and explore. And the second thing is, what is the school of thought? What is the body of thought that's out there at the moment from a regulatory point of view, from a self-regulatory point of view, from institutions like IPEV or ILPA, and other miscellaneous papers that may be out there. So we're gonna look at all that. Before we launch into some more private equity details, I wanted to take one philosophical parenthesis, and I'd like to quote a thinker called Jordan Peterson. I think Jordan Peterson made a good point, saying that he believed in equality of opportunity, so everybody should get the same chance regardless of their background, but he didn't believe in equality of outcome, that you would sort of mandate a quota for the number of people getting a certain position. And I would tend to agree with him in that. But let's get the view of somebody much more important than me. And this is Sharon Donnery. This is the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, and this is an interesting quote from a speech she made a couple of years ago. Tools like quotas are not about artificially leveling the playing field. They are to ensure access to the field in the first place. So she's arguing for quotas as a tool to improve access, to improve opportunity, but not to mandate outcomes. And so that's an interesting one, let's say, to take on board. So the question is, how should we express diversity? What kind of diversity should we be aiming for in private equity? So let's start with the regulators, the authorities. And in my research, I only really found one regulator who addresses the issue, and that is the European authorities. So this is a statement put out by the European Securities Market Authority, and it's relevant to fund managers who are regulated by MiFID II, which is part of the EU directive for alternative fund managers. And what does EMSA say? They say that all institutions should have and implement a policy promoting diversity on the management body. So what they're saying is you should try and be diverse on the management body and have a way of doing that, which sounds fair enough. Then they go into a bit more detail. The diversity policy should at least refer to the following criteria: educational and professional background, gender, age, and geographical provenance. So they mention age and where you're from. They don't specifically mention ethnic background. Then they come out with an interesting point that say the diversity policy for what they call significant institutions should include a quantitative target. So what ESMA is suggesting, that for a significant institution, there could be some kind of quota system of an unrepresented group in the management body, so the board of directors or the supervisory board, which sort of links to the kind of Norway model. Then finally, they say that institutions should implement a diversity policy for staff, things like career planning, and make sure that people are treated equally, which I think is probably self-evident, really. So that is the guidelines for SMA, and I would say they're kind of general guidelines. They're quite common sense, and are fairly moderate or centrist type guidelines, allowing people to interpret them as they want. Because if we do the numbers, we've got these, say, 6,400 firms globally. So if we're talking about European firms, there's maybe 3,000 GPs. Those of them who are regulated under European regulations are going to be the larger firms. So we may be talking about a few hundred firms who are going to be regulated by this directive. And of those few hundred, a handful will be significant enough to have a kind of quota system. So we've looked at what the regulator says, and in particular we found the European regulator was the only one really expressing themselves. So let's look at the self-regulator bodies. So the main ones, as we know, are going to be IPEV, ILPA, Invest Europe, North American Venture Capital Association, the Investment Council of the US, British Venture Capital Association, and some others. So what do they have to say about it? The one that's been the most articulated is ILPA, so the International Limited Partners Association out of Washington. And they came out with a diversity policy. They made a statement about it saying, in the wake of events in the US, this triggered them to get more active in terms of diversity. And so they've come up with a set of recommendations that has so in order to be considered by them to be a diverse firm, I guess, you have to do the following. You have to mandatorily have these 4 things. I'm putting them up on screen now for you. Firstly, you've got to have a diversity policy. Secondly, you need to follow the hiring and the promotion of your staff by gender and diversity. Thirdly, you have to have practices for diverse recruitment. Fourthly, you need to provide demographic data on the ethnic breakdown of your team if you're trying to do a new fundraise to the LPs. And then so that's fairly detailed. Plus 2 of the following, you've got to track the gender and ethnicity in the boards of your portfolio companies. That seems a bit excessive to me. Assign a senior partner, so you've got to have a chief diversity officer. You've got to give employees unconscious bias training. That sounds a bit like scary. It sounds a bit like a Chinese re-education camp. No thanks. Fourthly, you've got to create diverse employee resource groups. I'm not sure what that means. 5, incorporate diversity in staff performance. 6, promote diversity in the board of portfolio companies. Provide demographic data for all funds you have. Participate in diversity surveys. 9, educate unrepresented groups about careers and peace. So as far as these go, I'm starting to get a little bit uncomfortable from my perspective, say as a European and as a European fund manager. This is starting to get a little bit into social engineering. The other thing that confuses me about the ILPA standards is that they provide a spreadsheet under which you can classify people's ethnic background according to their system. But they only provide it for the US, Canada, UK and Australia. So they've got like a black, white, Latino, all this kind of thing for these 4 countries. So it seems like a kind of a Anglo-American type initiative, and particularly American. And so I'm starting to wonder how would that make any sense for other parts of the world? You know, how in France it's illegal to do surveys by ethnic background. You know, how are you going to do it in Germany? What, Turks and Germans? I couldn't imagine how you do it in Italy. And in the Balkans, you know, why would you even want to do that given the recent past? You know, Nigeria, what would you divide it between Igbos and Yorubas and Hausas? So I think this is it's some kind of Anglo-American initiative, which I think needs to have a global reach. Really needs a lot of work, and I think to me is a little bit of a step too far. But that's what the ILPA have come up with, and so far they're really the only one who've come up with their own kind of guidelines. Thirdly, I'd like to give you an example of some of the other initiatives out there, which I think we should at least be aware of. There was a recent publication called Guidance and Best Practice for Private Equity, and it was written by a kind of group. It seemed to be championed by a group called Adelpha, which I believe is an all-female M&A boutique out of London. And here we're starting to get, and this was endorsed by the British Venture Capital Association, although I don't think they had any direct part in drafting this. And this is where we're starting to get into the political correctness stuff. So here we've got some recommendations from their report. Mandate recruiters to provide 50-50 gender split options. Hire a target number of percentage of diverse candidates, so kind of a quota system. Set specific gender targets at leadership level. Have leadership attend mandatory training. Again, we're back to the Chinese re-education camps. Implement mandatory training for employees, so not just the management, but everyone's got to go to build cultural awareness and spot microaggressions. This sounds like political correctness training. No thanks. Set diversity target for diversity of investments. Set targets. Pipeline should have a minimum of 50% of deals that are female founded. So here we're getting a little bit into the realm of the ridiculous. What else? Challenge companies that have male leaders. Well, if I'm going to invest in an entrepreneur company somewhere in Italy, I'm not going to start challenging them about their diversity. I've got plenty of other fish to fry in terms of building value in that company. So no, I'm going to pass on that one. And so This is an example of kind of going too far. It's real kind of George Orwell 1984 newspeak. And I don't think I think something like that doesn't really work, because taking this kind of politically correct activist, social activism approach really is just going to alienate a lot of the mid-cap fund managers. So it should be something, if it's going to be diversity, it should be handled on a kind of middle of the road way. And you know, this particular paper was all authored by, ironically, it was authored by a group, an all-female Anglo-American group, so not even very diverse in terms of the authors. And I really don't know what the British Venture Capital Association is doing, endorsing some piece of work like this. So to give you a few views from my point of view as a run-of-the-mill mid-cap fund manager, I think there's no harm in trying to favour diverse recruitment. So what I mean by that is, at the junior level, and you've got the CVs at the beginning, no harm in, 20-year-olds or juniors, you can't tell one from the other because they're all a blank kind of canvas. And so there's no harm in having 50% female or 50% male or some other diversity kind of approach. So I think from that point of view, why not? But once they go into the interview system, there should be no preference in terms of mandating an outcome. Or you may have an argument, okay, if we've got 10 graduate trainees, let's make sure at least 4 are women, because they're only graduate trainees. So anyway, they're all the same with each other. But I don't think you can do it once they go into their careers, because then you've got, the problem is you bring in somebody because of their diversity quota, everybody knows it. Everyone's going to say, oh, he or she's only here because they're on the quota. And that's going to affect them, and it's going to affect the morale of everybody else. The other area where you could do a quota is in the board. Because remember, most boards of the world are not public company boards with all this best practice. They're boards, entrepreneurs' boards. It might be entrepreneur's sister who's a board member or something like that, or political appointee. So, I mean, the board's got enough issues as it is. So putting in an extra member on a diversity basis, if it's a possibility, you can do that. It'll get lost in the wash of all the other problems. And if that person turns to be incompetent, that's just something you're going to be able to manage through. But you can't do that with a senior member of operational management. So that's my view. I think there's room for manoeuvre at the junior level, at the board level, but not in terms of the middle management or the senior management. Okay, so I hope you found this interesting. I think the way to approach diversity is that it should be culturally sensitive, means it can't just be an Anglo-American narrative by a specific group within Anglo-America. That's not going to work. It's a wide world out there. So that's one of the issues of diversity. And secondly, we have to think about diversity in a kind of wide way. You know, it's about age, it's about ethnic group. Ethnic groups is a complicated issue because it will be cultural specific. So we have to approach diversity in a non-politically correct way, in a common sense way. And I think everybody does want to have a diverse group. And by the way, in my investment team, I'm the only middle-aged white Western male.